welcome to the NJC's 10-minute takeaway, where we will try and cram in as much information as we can into a 10-minute workshop. I'm Tom Stenson, Head of Training and Audit Trainer for the NJC. And today I'm joined by Lynne Barry, who is our current president and former chair of the NJC, who is a former teacher and also an audit trainer. And today's topic is going to be all about client-centered learning. And our 10 minutes starts now. So what are your thoughts on client-centered learning, Lynne?
Well, I think the most important thing is probably that the lesson needs to fit the learner. Everybody's individual. All the pupils are different. They learn in different ways and at different times. So any lesson that we give has got to be tailored for that pupil. And I think that's the most important thing. If we can involve them in a practical way, they will get more enjoyment out of their lesson and they'll learn more as well. So I think it's about things like listening to them, helping give them options. So when we're setting goals together, giving them options if they don't know. It's really not about letting the client lead everything. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, this is one that I think I hear quite a bit, where people get confused between client-centered learning and client-led. You know, I don't know about you, but I've heard it when I'm observing lessons where the instructor says to the pupil, "So Fred, what do you want to do today?" And I think that isn't necessarily a bad question, but it's not the best question that you can ask. Because Fred might say, well, actually, I'd like to go to Burger King and go and have a burger today. And I think for me as well, where it had a bigger impact was when I trained 11 years ago. It was under the PST system. And so every lesson was structured around me, where now every lesson is always structured around my learner. And it's around, as you said, what they need at the time. And I think something that we've mentioned before, people don't know what they don't know. So a pupil can't always turn up and say, well, my observations at roundabouts wasn't very good, because they might not know that their observations are not very good. And I think that's where the listening and the conversation really comes in for learners as well, creating that conversation where we can take into account the prior experience of the learner, but also what their thoughts and feelings are.
Definitely the word there that you used, which was conversation, that's what it's all about, isn't it? It is a conversation taking place between yourself and your learner. So whereas I think when I first came into this industry, it was much more instruction, which, because I had been a former teacher, didn't quite feel right anyway, if I'm honest. It's not about somebody perhaps taking a roundabouts lesson, and always by lesson 13 all the pupils are doing roundabouts and they all do it in the same way. It just is not like that anymore if we're going to really involve the pupil. And actually this is what DVSA want us to do, because we were talking earlier, weren't we, about the national standards and how the national standards are also introducing and want us to be client-centered.
Yeah. And it runs through the whole of our training, doesn't it? When you and I are delivering an audit training session, it's still client-centered. You know, when we're assessed on our audit assessment, it still needs to be client-centered. So whether I'm teaching a learner or whether I'm teaching a trainee, those core skills of having a conversation, listening to what the pupils or the trainee has said to me, basing my understanding on their previous experience, and then finding out what works for them and doesn't work for them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's about setting a plan between the two of you. And we've already mentioned in these 10-minute takeaways, I think, the fact that the very first lessons we have are where this all gets set into place.
Yeah.
So when people say that actually they're finding it really hard to get their pupils to answer questions, I think you need to start really early on, and we've talked about that sort of verbal contract where you're talking to the pupil and you're asking them, for example, you know, if they want to ever ask any questions, then please do. There's no such thing as a silly question. And likewise, I will be asking you some questions so that I know what you're thinking and what you actually know in a way that I can help you. So if they understand that from the beginning, they're more likely then, if the conversation starts to flow, to carry on like that. And therefore, when you say, hopefully people really don't use this expression, what do you want to do today? It doesn't have that awkward silence. So it's setting a plan between you and with good questioning skills as well, because I think that's part of being client-centered. So, you know, what was your favorite part of the last lesson? What did you learn last lesson? Did anything surprise you, or did you find anything particularly challenging? Is there anything I can help you with? So that they know you're a team together. And I think that's what the client-centered is about, to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I always feel it's, which comes into our conversation, it's about the engagement. It's trying to get them to take that active role, because I think we've mentioned before as well, I want my pupils to build on their problem solving skills, because I'm not always going to be sat next to them. So, you know, I want them to think for themselves, and I want to try and encourage them, and I want to listen to what they're feeling and how they think about things, because then I can help structure my lesson around all that information that they've given me.
Yeah, talking about structuring a lesson, it's really important, I think, in teaching and learning, that you come from what you already know. You may not realize you know it, but with good questioning, we'll work it out. What you know into the new and the unknown. So we're not saying never tell, you know, never don't tell them. Sometimes we need to tell them, and we are in a moving situation, aren't we? A situation where risk can come very suddenly. So obviously at times we will have to intervene and come in, and we might have to tell people, but after that we can have that conversation again. So it is about the fact that this is risky, that there are risks involved, and we've got to manage those with the pupil, and that initial chat with the pupil will help them understand that as well, I think.
And from what you mentioned earlier, and I suppose actually from your previous job, I find myself really lucky, because we only have one pupil at a time that we typically have to deal with. So I can find out what works for that learner and what doesn't work, and I can structure it around them, as opposed to having 30 people in a classroom where I've got to structure the lesson to fit everybody. Well, we've got individuals, and every individual learns differently. And that's what I really like about client-centered learning, is that it might not work for me, but if it works for the learner, why am I not promoting that? Why am I not helping them to move forward in a way that suits them instead of a way that suits me?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point. I mean, I used to teach a practical subject. There were 20 people in the class at any one time, all with a central goal, because it needed to be more like that in a group. And it was a practical subject where they were actually cooking something. So there were risks involved as well. So it was very similar to what I do now. But there were always items for anybody that was finishing very quickly.
Yeah.
But then there was always things for somebody, and help for somebody that was taking that a little bit longer or a little bit slower, and we team people up with each other to help each other. So you were constantly being flexible and adapting things for all the people in that group. But you are correct, with one person at a time, that actually is much, much easier.
And the fact that you've mentioned sort of adapting, we know from the DVSA that that's the most, according to them, the most common reason for failing standards checks is not adapting the lesson. And I do feel that stems from partially being perhaps not as client-centered as we could do, because we still have to manage the risk. I still need to watch my learner, and I still need to see whether they're doing the correct things. One of the terms that I often use is bridging the gap. So if I find out what the pupil knows and then what they don't know, all we have to do is fill in that bit in between. So as an educator, that's easier, because I'm not having to do this information dump. And hopefully it's easier for them because it's smaller steps.
Yeah, going back to part 3 and the standards check, it's interesting, isn't it, that we started off here by saying that the lesson should fit the learner. So the starting point for a part 3 or standards check needs to be find your pupil. And I don't know if you find this, but so many people come that I'm helping or rescue training, and they say to me, well, I know what I want to teach. And when I say, well, when is this? You know, it can be in like 2-3 months' time that they're doing this, but they already know what they're going to do, but they haven't got a clue who the pupil is. This is the wrong way round. It's incorrect. To me, you need to find your pupil first, and then you need to work out what that pupil needs nearer the time and on that day. And if your normal lessons are client-centered and done in that way, then it should be easy enough to do that. And
it should seem far more natural in that situation. Right, we are at the end of our 10 minutes.
Are we?
So yeah, that's the end of our 10-minute takeaway. Thank you very much for joining us again, Lynne.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.